About disorders of perception and attention. This is chapter 4. Maybe. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Synesthesia. This is a condition in which individuals presented with sensory input of one modality consistently and automatically experience a sensory event in a different modality, for example, seeing color or hearing musical notes. When presented with a particular stimulus, a person with synesthesia, a synesthete, will consistently and automatically experience another sensory event, sometimes in the same modality, for example, both in vision, sometimes in another sense. The most common form is to experience a color on seeing or hearing a letter, number, or word. This is really kind of an interesting chapter because a lot of this is speculation. They talk about some of these problems and where they come from, and then they say they can't prove it. It gets a little interesting. I'll try to deal with this chapter as if everything was definite, but a lot of this is speculation. The triggers of synesthetic experience are called inducers, and the experience is sometimes referred to as the concurrent. Hence, Monday night induced the concurrent yellow, and 7 might induce red. Other examples include colors being induced by familiar faces or days of the week, but also feeling sounds, seeing musical notes, seeing tastes, and tasting colors. Many synesthetes also report that stimuli that follow a reliable sequence, for example, letters of the alphabet, days of the week, months of the year, are experienced in a particular spatial arrangement. Sorry, I was just thinking that I needed to take out all the English parts of this thing. Synesthesia is usually an unidirectional process. The letter A may give rise to the perception of red, but seeing red does not induce A. For most synesthetes, simply imagining the inducer can be enough to produce the response. Synesthetic experiences are limited to fairly low level percepts, such as color or spatial location, rather than the appearance of a face or an object. Almost all synesthetes report that they have had the condition for as long as they can remember. Based on response rates to newspaper adverts, Baron Cohen et al. In 1996 estimated the incidence of synesthesia at about 1 in 2,000, with approximately 80% being female. Using more representative methods, Ward in 2013 suggests that an approximately equal number of men and women have synesthetic experiences. Prevalence rates in these studies ranged from 1.4% of the general population showing letter, number, color synesthesia, 0.2% showing taste, shape synesthesia, and up to 20% seeing particular sequences as spatial arrays. Baron Cohen reported that about one-third of synesthetes respondents reported having a relative who also had synesthesia. This is higher than expected based on the general frequency in the population, and subsequent studies suggest a genetic component. Even when family members do share synesthesia, they're no more likely to agree on the color of any particular letter than unrelated synesthetes. The majority of synesthetes report more than one type of synesthetic experience. Dixon et al. In 2004 distinguished two forms of synesthetic experience: projectors, who experience the color as if it were out there in the physical world, superimposed on the inducer, and the associators, who see the color in their mind's eye. Associators are typically not confused about the actual color of the letter, for example, despite also experiencing the concurrent color. Dixon et al. Report that about 90% of synesthetes in their sample were associators. Not being able to see does not necessarily prevent a person from having visual synesthetic experiences. Stephen and Blakemore in 2004 reported that details of 6 people who had been blind for many years, who nevertheless experienced colors on hearing or thinking about letters or numbers. All had experienced letter color synesthesia for as long as they could remember. One had been blind for 35 years. Another experienced color when he touched the raised dots of Braille characters, even though he had been without color vision for 10 years. This suggests that synesthesia persists for very long periods with little or no natural experience in the referred modality. Among the most frequent inducers of synesthetic experiences are things learned as children, such as letters, numbers, and days of the week. Whithoff and Winnower in 2013 linked consistent color letter associations in 11 synesthetes to a specific Fisher-Price educational colored letter set that had been manufactured between 1972 and 1990. This result does not mean that all synesthesia is based on such developmental experiences, but it suggests that learning can play a role in determining the particular experience associated with an inducer. And this is actually the Fisher-Price set that they were talking about. Most synesthetes regard their condition as a good thing. However, Baron Cohen et al. In 1996 described one individual, JR, who experienced particularly strong color and sound associations that unusually operated in both directions. Sounds induced synesthetic color, colors induced synesthetic sound. JR found this rather overwhelming and restricted her lifestyle to avoid excessive stimulation. In the synesthesia Stroop studies, synesthetes could not help but experience red when they see the letter A, and the A is presented in blue ink. They may suffer from interference from others, their own synesthetic response in naming the ink color. For stimuli that are not inducers, there should be no such interference. This is exactly what was observed, suggesting that even when it is interfering with a task, synesthesia indeed cannot be switched off. For example, the responses are mandatory or automatic. Functional MRI takes advantage of detecting changes in the oxygen level of blood in different parts of the brain. Areas that are working harder during a given task require more oxygen, and this arrives via the blood a few seconds after the work is done and takes a few more seconds to dissipate. When we are looking at functional MRI patterns, therefore, we are not looking directly at brain function, but a map that is somewhat blurred, both spatially and in time. In a brain where blood is flowing in many directions for different reasons, creating a noisy signal. Electroencephalography, EEG, is another functional brain imaging technique that records minute changes in voltage detectable from electrodes harmlessly resting on the scalp. These measures are very sensitive to millisecond by millisecond changes, but gives us only a crude idea about from which parts of the brain or combinations of parts the signals are coming. Very occasionally, it is possible to directly record electrical activity from a small group of brain cells, for example, when a volunteer is being prepared for essential brain surgery. This gives you a very precise picture of the response to a given stimulus, etc., in that area, but no way of knowing how this links to what is happening in the rest of the brain. The methods described so far are observational correlational, as an area may respond under certain conditions, but we do not know exactly what it is doing or how it contributes to a behavioral response. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is a method that allows stronger interference about the functional involvement of a brain area in a process. In TMS, an electromagnetic coil near the scalp is used to induce an electrical pulse in the underlying cortical region. This can cause excitation or, with repeated stimulation, inhibition or underexcitability, a little bit like a temporary brain lesion in that area. If inhibition worsens performance on a task, it suggests that brain area was normally contributing to good performance. A limitation of this technique is that it is only really effective near the cortical surface. Different forms of synesthesia may be associated with different patterns. Currently, the brain regions most commonly activated during synesthetic responses lie in the frontal and parietal lobes, particularly in a fold in the brain in this region called the intraparietal sulcus, or the IPS. This region is implicated in integrating across multimodal sensory information, for example, vision and audition, and hence it is also a plausible candidate for explaining why activity in one sensory modality may become linked to an experience in another. And this is the interparietal sulcus right here, this red mark right here. The striate cortex, or area V1, is central to visual perception, and this is the V1 area right here. Damage to the left striate cortex will result in blindness in the right visual field of both eyes, and damage to the right striate cortex will result in blindness in the left visual field of both eyes. These areas of blindness are called scotomata, plural for scotoma, scotomata, plural for scotoma. To imagine this effect as you look straight ahead, your visual world will be restricted to the right or left side of your current view, with the extent of the missing area varying in proportion to the degree of brain damage. Sorry, I had to take a drink. The most widely accepted explanation for blind sight is that we have two separate. Blind sight has to do with the fact that you can't see in a certain area, yet you still respond to what is in that area. It's known as blind sight. There were about 2 pages on blind sight and how they thought that it existed in the book, but I didn't put it in here because it's all speculation. And every time they said, "Well, this researcher thinks this," then they'd say, "But this researcher says that's not true," and then this researcher says this. The primitive non-striate system might be sensitive to movement, speed, and other potentially important characteristics of a stimulus without giving rise to conscious perception. Such a system might be extremely useful, for example, allowing a frog reflexively to dart out its tongue in a very fast and accurate movement to catch a fly. Perhaps blind sight represents the working of this primitive visual system, whose functioning is normally masked by the conscious perception, which results from the action of the striate visual system. Patients with blind sight are able to respond to a stimulus they cannot see. In unilateral spatial neglect, the opposite seems to be true. Patients fail to respond to stimuli that they can see. A patient may have normal vision, yet fail to react to objects or events to one side of the space, hence the terms unilateral, one-sided, and neglect, ignoring rather than being blind to. The condition has a number of other names, including hemi-inattention, as in hemisphere inattention, contralateral neglect, and simply spatial neglect. These generally represent terminological preferences rather than different conditions. Unilateral spatial neglect, also called hemispatial neglect or hemispatial inattention, is difficult is difficulty in noticing or acting on information from one side of the space, typically caused by a brain lesion to the opposite hemisphere. And this is what happens in unilateral spatial neglect. They're unable to tell you what is happening on the other side. So they draw pictures where one face only has one eye. The clock face, they know there's 12 numbers on a clock face, but they only put all the numbers on one side. This is a flower. They only put petals on one side, as you can see. And this house is incomplete, of course. The main cause of unilateral spatial neglect is stroke, an interruption to the brain's blood supply. Because of its organization, this interruption will primarily affect one or other hemisphere. Although stroke may seem like an exotic neuropsychological phenomenon, it is extremely common. Up to 84% of patients with damage to the right hemisphere of the brain have stroke. From stroke will show evidence of ignoring information on their left. Similarly, up to 64% of patients with left hemisphere damage can show the opposite pattern, ignoring information on their right. One of the most robust and mysterious findings in neuropsychology is, however, that this fairly balanced picture is seen only very early on after the stroke. In other words, after a while, they will start recovering from the stroke, and this will go away. This unilateral spatial neglect will go away. Now, you may be asking yourself, how does this happen? The answer is yes, a portion of this individual's brain no longer exists. It is dead. But what happens is all of these responses that took place in that area of that necrotic tissue, that dead area, it starts to recover and it starts to reroute itself so that now you can do these things again. If you've ever been around somebody with a stroke, when they first had a stroke, part of their face was paralyzed potentially, they slurred their words, they walked with a limp, and then after a month or two, all of a sudden, it's not all of a sudden, it's with a lot of work, they retrain themselves to not be paralyzed on one side of their face. Now they can walk normally. They can do things with the side that is the problem, is potentially the problem. So what happens is that they are recovering from their stroke by rerouting all of these neural signals in their brain. Now here's the interesting part, and this is the part that's not in your book. Women are better at rerouting areas of their brain than men are. And the reason is because the female corpus callosum is 11% larger than the male corpus callosum. Now, this doesn't mean that just because a male has had a stroke that he's not going to recover. What it does mean is that if it's female, she's more likely to recover faster than he is. When I was living on another reservation, we had a set of twins, male and female. They were in their 60s, and they both had a stroke at the same time. It was the most bizarre thing. And nobody was quite sure what was going on. But they both had a stroke. Within about 2 months, you couldn't tell that she'd had a stroke at all. But it took him much, much longer to get to the point where it seemed like he hadn't had any problems. As a matter of fact, he continued to have paralysis in his face. He had this interesting tick in his face that made his cheek jerk, and that never went away. Now, with her, you couldn't tell that she'd had a stroke. And they were twins. Of course, they were fraternal twins, but they were still twins. For some reason, left neglect following right hemisphere lesion is markedly more severe and persistent than its right neglect left hemisphere equivalent. That's a stroke to the right side. Patients with stroke, and this may be one of the reasons. This may be one of the reasons why, when they do research, they're looking at people who have had strokes on the right side of their brain, and therefore they have a left side problem. And as a matter of fact, most people have left side problems. If somebody had a stroke, it's usually in the right side of their brain. Patients with stroke may fail to notice objects. Did I do this? Yeah. May fail to notice objects in clear view on the left, ignore people approaching from the left, or eat food only from the right side of their plate. Neglect can affect other modalities, such as awareness of one side of one's own body, and even imagined or remembered scenes. Drawing a clock face from memory, a right-hand stroke victim will often omit the numbers between 7 and 11, or will try to squeeze these numbers onto the right side of the clock, as this individual did. This suggests distortions or omissions in their once intact mental representation of a very familiar object in addition to their current perceptions of the world. A definition of unilateral spatial neglect is that it is a failure or difficulty in responding to information on one side of space that is not explained by basic sensory laws. Damage to primary visual areas can produce blindness for one half or portions of space. How does this differ from USN? Many patients with USN also have some loss of vision on the affected side, hema and anopia, and because the rehabilitation implications of the two disorders may differ. The most obvious difference between USN and visual field loss is that the former can exert an influence across modalities, whilst the latter is restricted to vision. USN has been reported in audition, tactile exploration, touch and body sensation, haptic and somatosensory perception, imagery, and even smell. Under normal conditions, in addition to missing many targets on the left, the patient showed a strong tendency to cross out the same targets on the right of the sheet over and over again. This tendency to repeat actions without obvious cause is called perseveration and is a noted feature of neglect. And some other neurological conditions. When, however, the ignored targets on the left of the sheet were replaced by non-targets, this remarking of the targets on the right dramatically declined. This is a puppy that got caught in a bowl and he couldn't get out. Eventually he did get out, of course. A common clinical observation is that patients with persistent chronic left neglect tend to be drowsy and appear to have difficulty remaining focused on all sorts of tasks. This impression has been supported by research showing that such patients indeed tend to perform very poorly on non-spatial sustained attention measures. By itself, this could reflect two independent consequences of overall stroke severity. Robertson et al. In 1998 showed that alerting patients with a loud tone temporarily but dramatically reduced or reversed their neglect, even when the tone was to their right. A number of studies have now shown that some children with diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder who struggle to sustain their attention can show a marked pattern of emissions reliably from one side of space. So far, this has always been the left. Healthy volunteers show significant rightward shifts in spatial attention after sleep deprivation, when awake but sleepy in the early hours of the morning, and after long periods of repetitive task performance. Berheim et al. In 2014 asked healthy young participants to relax with their eyes closed in a comfortable deck chair and to indicate whether each of a series of tones played through headphones had come from their left or their right side. When alert, they were relatively accurate at the task, but as they became drowsy, they began to report approximately a quarter of the left-sided tones as having come from the right. They showed no such change on right tones, if anything, becoming more certain that they were from the right, consistent with a shift in attention in this direction. While these biases are not generally as marked as in USN, they provide potential insights into why the left neglect in particular may be so persistent. USN occurs at a remarkably high frequency following stroke. It has also been reported following damage to a wide variety of brain areas, including the parietotemporal and frontal lobes, and a good number of subcortical areas, Mort et al. In 2003. This has led to the idea that normal spatial attention may reflect a dynamic and easily disrupted competitive balance between widely distributed networks in the brain's two hemispheres. In this view, the left hemisphere is pushing attention into the right space and the right hemisphere pushing back to the left. Agnosia is an ancient Greek term meaning non-knowledge. Visual agnosia, therefore, roughly translates as not knowing what you are seeing. Patients with visual agnosia following a brain injury can see, they can move around without bumping into things, and they can accurately reach for and pick up objects. They may be able to recognize an object through touch or hearing, a characteristic sound that it makes, or from someone else's description of the object and or its uses. Where they now struggle to a greater or lesser degree is in identifying an object by looking at it. From Lissauer's 1890 observation, he suggested that there were two broad patterns of impairment. In the first, called appreciative agnosia, a person has problems in identifying objects via vision. In addition, they will find it hard to draw a copy of an object, struggle to describe its component parts, and have difficulty in determining whether two similar objects are identical. In contrast, while a person with associative agnosia will also have problems in identifying objects via vision, the ability to draw a copy of an object to accurately discriminate two similar objects and to describe an object's component parts will be better preserved. And what we see in the picture is a case of associative agnosia, at least the one, the B, this one right here. You know, and I kept misidentifying what that was. That's a ring, and I kept seeing it as something else. Form agnosia is now generally accepted term for patients who are unable to discriminate between objects and cannot copy line drawings of objects. Integrative agnosia is now the generally accepted term for associative agnosia because it more accurately reflects the processing difficulties that patients experience. It refers to patients who can perceive the individual shapes and elements of objects, but are unable to integrate these into a representation of the whole object. Carbon monoxide poisoning seems to be a particularly common cause of form agnosia, although in rare cases it can arise following brain damage from assault or cardiac events. Integrative agnosia has been reported after stroke, brain trauma, and Alzheimer's disease. In addition, patients with integrative agnosia appear to have more medial ventral lesions than patients with form agnosia. Patients with visual form agnosia experience a very confused and distorted visual world in which almost nothing seems familiar and even basic forms are indistinguishable from each other. The best analogy would be to imagine looking at the world through a very powerful microscope. To look at an object, you would have to scan the microscope around the object, trying to remember what each view of the object has revealed. To form a representation of the whole object, you would need to assemble a mental picture of the overall structure of the object by piecing together the independent microscopic views. In this way, despite being able to see the component details of the object accurately, you would find it very difficult to recognize the whole, and the more complex the local detail, the harder the recognition task would become. Looking at individuals suffering from form and integrative agnosia, it is speculated that the parietal cortex could provide information about the orientation and structure of objects in order to help guide movement, and the temporal lobe provide information about object identity, giving rise to dissociable representations. For example, one could be intact and the other impaired, or vice versa. This led Goodale and Milner in 1992 to develop their two streams of visual processing account. They suggested that visual information follows two main streams or routes. The ventral stream travels to the temporal lobe and is thought critical for identifying objects and attaching meaning and significance to them, along with other cognitive structures. The dorsal stream travels to the parietal lobe and processes spatial information to help guide skilled movements. Prosopagnosia is a word coined by Bodemer in 1947 to describe patients who had marked difficulties in recognizing familiar faces, but who could identify other objects. People with severe prosopagnosia can struggle to recognize the faces of family members, friends, and even themselves in a photo. This does not mean that they do not know who the people are. They may be able to recognize others through their voice or their walk and tell you a great deal of information about that person. However, the connection between that knowledge and the visual representation of the face has been compromised. Prosopagnosia can result from a brain injury in adulthood or childhood, or be present apparently from birth without obvious brain damage. Damage to the ability to recognize faces after many years of normal recognition may have different implications to a lifetime with the difficulty. Researchers have identified two separate deficits, acquired and developmental prosopagnosia, and of course, two is misspelled there. Early autopsy studies reported that prosopagnosia was caused by bilateral lesions in the occipitotemporal cortex. However, in rarer cases, it can follow unilateral damage to the right hemisphere, and even rarer still, by left hemisphere lesions. This is the occipitotemporal cortex right here between these pink and green areas. Most cases of prosopagnosia have damage in the fusiform and lingual gyri, although there are also cases of damage in more anterior temporal areas. The fusiform area has been shown to be a key structure in face and object processing, and numerous studies have shown that the fusiform gyrus contains an area dedicated to face processing, hence called the fusiform face area, often shortened to FFA. There is variability in the location of the FFA across individuals, and this may help to explain why prosopagnosia sometimes seems to occur with damage in only one hemisphere. And as you can see, this is where it is. This is the bottom of the brain. We're looking up at the brain, and this is the FFA on each side. While the FFA plays a key role in face processing, there is still variability in the type of brain damage that can result in prosopagnosia. However, there is no single area in the brain that is responsible for processing faces. Instead, this highly developed and demanding process is underpinned by a distributed neural network that is made up of many bilateral regions. Barton in 2008 examined this by reviewing data and found that the most severe impairments were found in patients who had bilateral occipitotemporal lesions involving the fusiform gyri. Bilateral lesions in this area resulted in severe impairments in the ability to form an image of a face, to perceive and integrate configural information, and also resulted in the lowest levels of familiarity with famous faces. Martin concluded that the right fusiform gyrus was involved in configurational processing and that memory for faces was more severely disrupted when these bilateral lesions also included right anterior temporal lobe damage. Studies find that prognostic patients are significantly more impaired with faces than other non-face items. Others have used within category judgments about natural objects such as different cows or sheep, which may show more similar variations to faces than manufactured goods. Breyer et al. In 1983 reported that a farmer who became prospagnostic was still able to recognize his cows, while Bornstein et al. In 1969 described a prospagnostic farmer who could not recognize either humans or his own cows. Some, but not all, prospagnostic patients show evidence of covert recognition. That is, their brain may show a differential response to different faces, even though the person does not seem to be consciously aware of it. Some demonstrate covert familiarity, different neural responses to a familiar compared with unfamiliar faces. In other cases, it has been possible to demonstrate some implicit unconscious knowledge about the person shown in a photograph, such as occupation or name. And of course, the reason I have a picture of Brad Pitt is because he has disclosed that he suffers from prosopagnosia. That is the end of the chapter. So I'll talk to you guys next week. Next week, I think, is short-term memory. Sounds like a lot of fun. So take it easy.